Let's talk about the time when the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, in 1838, issued an executive order that declared that the Latter-day Saints were enemies and must be exterminated. Now, the notorious Extermination Order is a cataclysmic moment in Mormon history. It takes a disproportionate place in Latter-day Saint memory, and for good reason. It's an example of, in many Latter-day Saints' mind, the rabid anti-Mormonism and the violence that was inflicted, and that core memory has shaped much of Latter-day Saint history since then. It's also a crucial story in American history, not just religious history, but political history, frontier history. I often include the Extermination Order when I teach courses on early American history because it features so many converging tensions and moments and ideas at the heart of the American experience. Now, there's no sugarcoating it. The Extermination Order was horrible, but we can contextualize it. And we also need to discuss what led to that order, what the Latter-day Saints did, what their neighbors did, and what then resulted in Lilburn Boggs ordering the extermination of his own citizens. For instance, in the story, it's important to note that Lilburn Boggs was not the first person to invoke extermination as a result of the conflict and even a desired result. That was none other than Sidney Rigdon, an LDS member of the First Presidency. So in this video, I want to talk about the entire Grizzly history, the backdrop, the broader context, in part because I'm frequently asked in the comments whenever I discuss things like Mountain Meadows Massacre, well, why don't you talk about what happened in Missouri? Well, here I am talking about it. But as I talk about it, I want to place it in the broader narrative so that we can learn the important and sobering lessons that come from the travesty of Lilburn Boggs' Extermination Order. But first, we need a little bit of context, and those of you who are veterans of my channel know what's coming next, because we have to understand the broader context of what was going on in America to make sense of what otherwise appears as illogical. And the theme that I want to emphasize here is the notion of rights that American citizens had during this time. Now, when we think of rights, we think of the rights to do things, the right to practice religion, the right to vote. But in early America, some of the most disputed rights were the rights to not have things done to you, specifically the rights to not be forcibly removed. In other words, the right to remain. And in the 1830s, the right to remain in a physical space was a very contested topic. Because it was connected to the rights of citizenship. It was also connected to the ideas of race and belonging. And at the center of this question of who gets to belong in a democratic republic that features so many diverse people and what happens when they start conflicting. Now, the two most prominent examples of these disputes over the rights to remain were, on the one hand, African Americans, those who were enslaved or free, that many white Americans did not feel belonged in the United States. So one of the growing movements in the 1820s and 1830s was what was called the American Colonization Society. And the American Colonization Society argued that, A, we first need to emancipate those who are enslaved, and then second, we need to take all those people and remove them back to Africa. And the American Colonization Society had a number of prominent leaders and presidents arguing for this removal of African Americans because the American body could not fit, they believed, those with African ancestry. Similarly, at the same time during the 1830s, we see the forced eviction and removal of Native Americans and many of these indigenous tribes who were in the West, pushing them out in the far West. That's when we get the Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act, but based on a similar idea that these non-white bodies do not belong in the American Republic, that democracy could not function with such disparate people, which justifies the forced removal of those individuals. Now, you need to understand that broader context in order to make sense of what happens with the Mormons. And first, we'll talk about the Mormons in Jackson County, Missouri, where Joseph Smith initially declared Zion. And I may talk about Jackson County and his plots for Zion at some future video. But what's important to know here for this video is when the Latter-day Saints were forcibly evicted from Jackson County in the early 1830s, the justification given by those doing the evicting was that the Latter-day Saints did not belong in our society. They did not act like Americans. They were enforcing this notion of a quasi-white Protestant establishment that if you do not fit within these boundaries, you do not belong here. It was the same justification given for evicting Native Americans and for African Americans during the same decade. And the result of evicting the Mormons out of Jackson County was creating their own county, Caldwell County, with its capital far west. But note the similarities here. Caldwell County was basically a Mormon reservation that, just like the Native Americans don't belong around us and we need to kick them somewhere else, so too Latter-day Saints don't belong around us, so we're going to make them their own county, just like their Americans are doing with Liberia with freed, emancipated, enslaved people. We're going to move them to their own region because they do not fit in our society. It's also notable, if you haven't read Paul Reeves' wonderful book, Religion of a Different Color, that during this same time, Latter-day Saints are being depicted as not white, which might not make sense given that Latter-day Saints today are the whitest of religions, but back then, race was socially constructed, and because the Latter-day Saints operated a certain way, they're depicted as not being white and therefore having the rights of citizenship. Although I do want to emphasize that we can't equate the Mormon experience directly onto what Native Americans and African Americans were experiencing. Latter-day Saint leaders were granted a degree of privilege and participation that African American and Native American leaders were not. The very fact that they got to discuss with state and national leaders what's going on granted them a degree of citizenship. So I don't want to equate their experiences, but they all need to be understood within this broader context of the right to belong. By the way, if you appreciate this kind of analysis, placing Mormon history within the broader context and tracing out these important trajectories and stories of race, religion, and belonging and democracy, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. If you like to give back, please consider becoming a member. We really appreciate those who have taken that step. It allows us to continue putting in effort and work into these videos. Every Monday, I do these deep dives on particular topics. Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present. And then on Fridays, I do So You Want to Know More About X video, in which I pull back the curtains and we talk about particular historical documents and interpretive traditions, all meant to allow you to have the resources to make your own interpretations on these important topics. All right, let's get back to Missouri. So when Joseph Smith arrived in far west Missouri in early 1838, he was stepping into a volatile situation. The Latter-day Saints, a few years earlier, had been evicted out of Jackson County, what was supposed to be Zion, and then they had just recently had to move from Kirtland, Ohio, due to massive schisms and debates and the collapse of the Curtin Safety Society, a topic for another video. And when Joseph Smith arrives in far west Missouri, declaring it the new headquarters for the church, he is having to deal with a lot of pressing issues. Most notably, some of the most prominent LDS leaders, both coming from Kirtland as well as already residing in Missouri, are having a fight with Joseph Smith over control. And this includes some of the most prominent voices and members in the church since the faith's founding, like David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery, both initial witnesses to the Book of Mormon, who had held prominent leadership positions within the church, but now had a falling out with Joseph Smith over disputes over money, over disputes over land, and in the case of Cowdery, disputes over accusations of Fanny Alger. And when those prominent leaders were excommunicated, there was an expectation that they would then leave the Latter-day Saint refuge of far west Missouri, that they would be revoked of their right to remain, that the Latter-day Saints had a right to declare who gets to live within their settlement. And so these excommunication trials then expanded into removal trials of trying to get them out. And in the midst of those public and very heated debates, Sidney Sidney Rigdon, a member of the First Presidency, delivers on June 17th what comes to be known as a salt sermon, in which he compares these dissenters like Cowdery and the Whitmers to salt that had lost its savor and therefore had to be cast out, a New Testament reference. Many of these dissenters were then forced to leave, in part due to the creation of a vigilante police force created by the Latter-day Saints known as the Danites, which then moved the church into expanding into the dispute over who gets to belong within Latter-day Saint communities to where do Latter-day Saints belong within the broader state of Missouri. They declared that they were no longer going to be removed, and you could understand their anxiety. They had been kicked out of Jackson County. They had been kicked out of Kirtland. This new place in far west Missouri was not going to suffer the same consequence. So on July 4th, 1838, Sidney Rigdon declared in his 4th of July sermon that, or he warned, measures would come if anyone else tries to take them off of their godly appointed land and strip them of their rights as citizens. Here's a key text that I'll go ahead and put the text on the screen. And that mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them a war of extermination. For we will follow them until the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seed of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed. Joseph Smith declared it a fabulous sermon, one that reflected the Declaration of Independence the Saints were making, that they were no longer going to be bullied around. And this started to creep into their actions. And most notably, a significant development was then Latter-day Saints determined that they should be able to settle in counties surrounding Caldwell County. Remember, Caldwell County was the county set apart for the Latter-day Saints. But now they're saying that we have a right to remain anywhere in Missouri. So they start setting out in nearby Ray County and Davies County, and they established their own police force, this Danites group that had its own manifesto and declarations saying that we are exerting our own rights of American citizens to defend ourselves and to retain our sacred rights, again, to remain on this land. And that's when the problems start coming. Because by August and September of 1838, as the Mormons are spreading out into nearby counties, they were breaking what the state understood to be the agreement, that the Mormons, you're going to stay in your county, your reservation, not move outward. And then when elections came around in early August of 1838, and the Latter-day Saints expected to vote in those elections in these nearby counties, that drew a lot of concern. One candidate for office in Davies County declared that Mormons were criminals and should not be allowed to vote. And therefore, there was violence at several of these voting precincts, and most notably at Gallatin, where one of the mob leaders declared that Mormons must be treated, quote, no different than the Negroes. Again, tying into this broader racialized image of who gets to belong within the American body and who gets the rights of citizenship. This was then followed by a number of skirmishes between mobs in Missouri and the Mormons creating their own extra-legal factions. And at first, and notably, and this is an element that I don't see played up a lot in public discussion, the governor, who is Lilburn Boggs at the time, his initial reaction to this is to say, well, this is a local issue. We can't get involved. This is, in other words, Jacksonian democracy playing itself out, the rights of individuals to fight over each other on who gets to survive. All of these skirmishes result in increasing battles. Now, at first, the Missourians and the Mormons, they're just attacking towns and burning down villages, and they're not coming into direct confrontation. And this angered a lot of state authorities, and counties would plead for the state to step in. And eventually the state came to see it as a problem because the Mormons justifiably felt that they had to raise their own militia to defend themselves, although they then took that and went on the offensive. Then the state saw this as the Caldwell County militia moving into other counties and causing problems, which was crossing the line in their mind, because you can defend yourself, but as soon as you go into these other counties, you're causing problems. Now, the Latter-day Saints would say, well, we have the rights to settle in these other counties, so we have a right to protect that land on which we are settling. And when Latter-day Saints started going on the offensive, there were a number of prominent dissenters within the church. I talked about David Whitmer and Oliver Cowdery earlier, but now the apostles Thomas Marsh and Orson Hyde also feel that the church is taking the wrong course. They publicly leave the faith and they sign affidavits against this militarized version of Mormonism. Orson Hyde, of course, would later come back into the Latter-day Saint fold. Now, this culminates in what comes to be known as the Battle at Crooked River on October 25th, when Mormon troops attacked state troops that were stationed on the borders between Caldwell and Ray counties. There were a number of casualties on both sides, just a handful of deaths, but many more injured. The Latter-day Saints were seen as the victors, and then exaggerated reports of that battle reached the Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs, who had heard that great numbers of state troops had been killed. And building off of his already present animosity toward the Latter-day Saints, he had hated them since they had settled Jackson County in the 1830s. And now seeing them as overstepping the boundaries of what the state had granted them of just staying in Caldwell County, he issued Executive Order number 44 on October 27th, 1838. This is what comes to be known as the Extermination Order. This is what the document looks like, which you can find at the State of Missouri Archives online website. I'll include some links for that in the course description. But let's dissect the most important passage. This is the first major paragraph. Since the order of this morning to you, directing you to cause 400 mounted men to be raised within your division, I have received by others information of the most appalling character, which entirely changes the face of things and places the Mormons in the attitude of an open and avowed defiance of the laws and of having made war upon the people of the state. Your orders are, therefore, to hasten your operation with all possible speed. The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. If you can increase your force, you are authorized to do so to any extent you may consider necessary. And it goes on to give explicit orders of what happened. By the way, I'll include a link to where you can find that document in the video description. Now, I will note that some scholars have disputed what's meant by extermination here. That when it's saying that it must be exterminated or driven by the state, some scholars, including some faithful Latter-day Saints, are saying that that's not an either or. They're exterminated or driven by the state, but that driven from the state is the definition of extermination here, just a removal. And I can see the virtues of that argument, but again, placing within the broader context, extermination is used frequently, especially in these frontier states, to also refer to death and killing. And that's how it's used when often referring to Native Americans and African Americans, which is why we need to understand that broader context. Now, 3 days after that executive order, we get the Haun's Mill massacre on October 30th, where 250 Missourians slaughtered 19 Mormons, including several children. Two things I want to note about the connection here. One, it is very unlikely that those who committed the atrocity at the Haun's Mill massacre, maybe I'll do an entire video on the Haun's Mill massacre at some point, those who committed the atrocity at Haun's Mill likely had not heard of the executive order yet. So you can't probably say that it was acting on those orders. Instead, though, that mob was probably just acting on the broader feeling of animosity and a feeling that they were at war. And second, one of the most prominent stories that come out of the tragic Haun's Mill massacre is when one of the Missourians shoots a young child, a defenseless, unarmed child, and they ask, why did you kill a young child? And the guy responds, well, nits make lice. It's a abhorrent, horrible saying. But what's notable, that same phrase, nits make lice, was often used to justify the slaughter of Native Americans on the frontier during the same time. Again, tying this full circle of this connection of seeing how Latter-day Saints were cast in the same batch of undesirable non-whites that are a threat to American society. Now, within a few days of this, Joseph Smith and other LDS leaders are forced to surrender, and then spend a miserable winter in Liberty Jail while thousands of Latter-day Saints are forced at gunpoint to leave the state in that miserable winter, an expulsion that would remain in Latter-day Saint minds for generations. So what are some of the lessons and the legacies that we can take from the Extermination Order? Well, first, I don't think we can lessen the horror of the Extermination Order. Even when we place it in this broader context, that should not soften the atrocity of what that Extermination Order aimed to do. And while Sidney Rigdon was indeed the first person to use extermination in the War of Words, it was Boggs who had the resources to back it up. And so I think we need to keep that in mind. Second, it's clear that Latter-day Saints played a role in the lead up to that moment. But at no point can you say that what they did made them deserving of an extermination order. Nothing justified the response, but that does not mean we should overlook those actions and historical activities and contexts that make that order fit within that narrative. And third, I think we can look at the entire Missouri crisis, and especially the executive order, as an example of democracy falling apart, of what happens when you create these us versus them dichotomies and otherize Mormons, Native Americans, African Americans as no longer deserving the rights of citizenship. And that's the violence that ensues, which I hope people who study or read about Missouri or often think about Missouri, leave comments on videos, well, what about Missouri? I hope that story then makes you more sympathetic to others who are oppressed and marginalized because they do not fit this idealized version of who belongs in the American society. Now, that extermination order theoretically remained on Missouri's books all the way up until 1976, though it was never really invoked. And historians debate about whether anyone was actually ever killed. It doesn't seem that it was a determining status, in part because the Mormon-Missouri War came to close very shortly after its issue. Governor Christopher Bond, the Missouri governor, rescinded the order in 1976. Here's an image of that rescission order, and expressed deep regret for the injustice and due suffering caused by Boggs's executive order, which I hope is one of the lessons we can learn. Now, you can find the Extermination Order itself, as well as many of the documents surrounding it, at the Missouri State Archives online website from their Mormon War Papers collection. I will include a link to that in the course description. If you want to read more about the broader history, I argue that the best book on it is by Leland Gentry and Todd Compton, Fire and Sword, A History of the Latter-day Saints in Northern Missouri, 1836 to 1839. It's a great summary that can catch you up on all of this important story. I hope this video made sense. If so, please hit the like button, share it with others so we can get out a full story of the Extermination Order and learn from its tragic relevance and legacies. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it allows us to take these lessons from the past and learn how we can avoid those conflicts here in the present, which feels like a pretty important lesson to have.